In the long history of English royalty, some names are remembered for their glorious triumphs, while others are remembered for the strange and unsettling way they met their end. Edward II was one such man. He was overthrown, imprisoned, and reportedly murdered in a manner so horrific and specific that it defied belief. A red-hot iron rod forced into his rectum, chosen to leave no visible trace on his body. So what mysteries still surround this chilling story? Let's uncover them in today's video. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. Throughout the long and complex history of the English monarchy, few kings have left behind a legacy so sharply at odds with their predecessor as Edward II. His father, King Edward I, also known by the fearsome title Hammer of the Scots, was the quintessential image of a medieval monarch, intelligent, ruthless, and commanding. Under his reign, England expanded its territories, consolidated its authority, and emerged as one of the most formidable powers of the 13th century. But when Edward I died and passed the throne to his son, the strength of the royal house began to erode. Edward II, in stark contrast to his father, was a man of impressive stature and physical strength, yet he lacked the resolve and sharp political instincts expected of a ruler. Rather than devoting himself to affairs of state or religious duties, he spent much of his time indulging in trivial pleasures, forming bonds with common laborers, and obsessing over a circle of favorites, men he elevated with such reckless affection that it sent shockwaves through the royal court. In the eyes of the nobility, Edward II was not just an ill-fitting presence on the throne, he was a threat to the very stability of the realm. Edward II was born in April of 1284, at a time when the English army had just completed the conquest of Wales. His birthplace, Caernarfon Castle, a coastal fortress in the northwest of Wales, was meant to stand as a symbolic declaration of English dominance over the newly annexed land. As the 14th child of King Edward I and Queen Eleanor of Castile, Edward II was never meant to be king. But fate had other plans. More than half of Edward III's and Eleanor's children died young from illness, and as his three older brothers passed away one by one, the fragile infant suddenly became the sole heir to the English crown. Though born of one of Europe's most commanding monarchs, Edward II showed from a young age that he was fundamentally different from his father. Whereas Edward I embodied military might, unshakable determination, and cold pragmatism, his son seemed marked by softness, indecision, and at times, an odd, almost bewildering eccentricity. Even in his boyhood, Edward showed little interest in the pursuits traditionally expected of a prince. While noble children of his age were trained in horseback riding, swordsmanship, hunting, and jousting to forge their leadership qualities, Edward found himself drawn instead to ditch diggers, blacksmiths, sailors, wandering singers, and street performers. And perhaps most concerning of all, Edward developed an early tendency to place blind trust in those he considered his intimates, individuals for whom his personal affections consistently outweighed both reason and the interests of the kingdom. With a childhood shaped in such a way, was Edward II fated from the beginning to fall into tragedy? Or were these early choices, seemingly innocuous at the time, the first quiet steps toward the downfall of a dynasty? Among all the favored companions who had passed through the life of Edward II, none left a mark as deep or as divisive as Piers Gaveston. Born into a noble family from Gascony, Gaveston first met Edward when both were still teenagers at the English court. From that moment on, a strange bond formed between them, one that would shadow Edward throughout the formative years of his personality and rise to power. While Edward I was still alive, he had taken note of the unusually strong influence Gaveston seemed to have over his son. Alarmed by this, he ordered Gaveston to be banished from court in the hope of severing their connection. But the death of Edward I in 1307 cleared the path for a new reign, and for Gaveston's return. One of Edward II's very first acts as king was to summon his long-exiled companion back to court and bestow upon him the title of Earl of Cornwall, a noble distinction typically reserved for members of the royal family. To the English aristocracy, this came as a profound shock, not only because of Gaveston's meteoric rise, but also because of the king's open and unchecked affection for him. The outrage reached its peak during Edward's coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey. While Queen Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, stood by her husband in the solemn ritual marking the dawn of a new era, the king's gaze was not directed at her. Instead, it was fixed on Gaveston. Worse still, Edward gifted Gaveston many of the royal wedding presents meant for Isabella, including pieces of crown jewelry and state treasures. In the eyes of the nobility, this was not only an insult to the queen, but a direct affront to royal dignity and the moral order of the English court. Whether Edward and Gaveston were lovers in the modern sense remains a matter of historical debate. No surviving contemporary documents confirm their relationship in explicit terms. Yet one chronicler of the time did remark that Edward loved Gaveston more than he loved any woman. The nobility, already wary of this young and unproven king, grew increasingly incensed. They viewed Gaveston as a corrupting force on the monarch's mind, an outsider who wielded excessive power within the realm. Worse still, Gaveston made no effort to hide his contempt for them. He openly mocked the lords, giving them insulting nicknames such as the Black Dog of Arden and Joseph the Jew. These provocations only served to pour oil on the fire. Eventually, the baron's patience reached its limit. The kingdom's most powerful lords forced Edward into a stark ultimatum: abandon Gaveston, or prepare for civil war. Reluctantly, Edward exiled Gaveston to Ireland, appointing him as the king's representative there. But the separation would not last. Through a mixture of pressure, bribery, and veiled threats, Edward managed to coerce the nobility into allowing Gaveston's return. And when he did return, neither he nor the king showed the slightest remorse. Instead, they continued to flaunt their defiance in the face of growing opposition. Gaveston's return was not just an act of provocation toward the nobles. It marked the beginning of a political tragedy that would haunt the rest of Edward II's reign. The king was not merely playing a dangerous game with weak cards. He was alienating the very men who might have saved his throne. The fury of the English nobility toward Piers Gaveston eventually passed the point of no return. His insults and unearned influence had united the most powerful lords of the realm against him. By this point, eliminating Gaveston was no longer viewed as a matter of political preference. It had become a duty in defense of the kingdom. And in 1312, the nobility's revenge was finally put into motion. Under the leadership of Richard de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, who had once been humiliated by Gaveston's mockery with the nickname, the Black Dog of Arden, a noble alliance hunted down and captured the king's favorite. Edward II once again abandoned his pregnant queen, Isabella, and fled north with Gaveston in a desperate attempt to evade their enemies. But it was futile. Gaveston was apprehended at Scarborough and escorted to Warwick. There, the assembled lords issued a damning verdict. Gaveston was declared a wicked counselor and an open enemy of the people. They accused him of sowing division throughout the kingdom and claimed that his unhealthy relationship with the king had brought the nation to the brink of civil war. On June 19, 1312, Piers Gaveston was run through with a sword and then beheaded in a field not far from Warwick Castle. When Edward II learned of Gaveston's death, he was devastated. His grief was a mix of personal anguish and wounded pride, and his anger ignited like a firestorm. Yet in that moment, Edward had little power to act. His position as king had grown so precarious that any direct retaliation was nearly unthinkable. He was forced to submit to political reality, signing power-sharing agreements and accepting noble oversight in exchange for a fleeting sense of stability. But Edward's resentment never faded. In the years that followed, he quietly began preparing for a resurgence, not only within the court, but on the battlefield as well. And it was in this bid to reclaim his authority that the king launched a military campaign against Scotland, a land that had grown increasingly defiant under the leadership of Robert the Bruce. Edward's attempt at revenge, however, would lead him to one of the most humiliating military defeats in the history of the English monarchy. In June of 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Edward II led a massive army with hopes of crushing the Scottish forces and restoring his tarnished reputation. But the campaign swiftly unraveled into catastrophe. The English army became bogged down, their strategy faltered, and panic swept through the ranks as the Scots launched a fierce counterattack. Rather than standing and fighting alongside his soldiers, Edward fled the battlefield. He slipped into Dunbar Castle and arranged for passage back to England by sea. The consequences were disastrous. Not only were thousands of English soldiers left to die, but the king's flight shattered his image in the eyes of his people. Once seen as a weak ruler, Edward was now openly derided as a coward, a failed strategist, and a monarch unworthy of his crown. With defeat piling upon defeat, one truth was becoming clearer than ever. The collapse of Edward II's reign was no longer a question of if, but when. Hugh Despencer, more precisely, Hugh Despencer the Younger, would go on to inherit the uniquely privileged position that Gaveston had once held. Like Gaveston, Despencer was intelligent, ambitious, and adept at earning the king's trust. But unlike his predecessor, Despencer's ambitions extended far beyond emotional intimacy or courtly status. He craved real power. With the quiet but determined support of his father, the Despencer family gradually established a vast sphere of influence around the throne. Edward II, politically feeble and emotionally isolated, handed Despencer everything, from land, noble titles, and control over key territories, to a deciding voice in the kingdom's most important policies. Entire estates were seized from rival nobles and granted directly to the Despensers. This blatant favoritism sparked a fresh wave of fury among the aristocracy. One of the individuals who witnessed and personally suffered from this resurgence of Despencer's power was none other than Queen Isabella of France, Edward's long-suffering wife. She had remained silent during the affair with Gaveston and endured humiliation in order to preserve the image of the monarchy. But now, watching the Despensers consolidate unchecked power and Edward sink deeper into failure, Isabella's patience began to unravel. Her discontent grew especially acute when foreign policy under Despencer's control started to collapse. In a crucial diplomatic moment in 1322, Charles IV of France, Isabella's own brother, summoned Edward II to France to perform a feudal act of homage for the Duchy of Gascony, an English-held territory in France. This was a mandatory feudal obligation, and any delay or refusal could be interpreted as an act of war. Edward II, acting on the advice of Hugh Despencer, refused to travel to France in person. This decision was not just an insult to King Charles. It also provided France with the perfect justification to launch a military campaign against Gascony. A diplomatic crisis erupted almost immediately, and Edward was forced to send Queen Isabella to France to resolve the situation. But this time, Isabella did not travel merely as an envoy. She departed with a quiet determination to end the reign of Edward II and to destroy the Despencer regime by any means necessary. When Isabella was sent to France to negotiate on Edward's behalf during the Gascony crisis, she did not return to England as expected. In Paris, she publicly declared that she could not return while a certain individual stands between me and my lord the king. A clear and deliberate reference to Hugh Despencer the Younger. But Isabella's resistance did not end with words. She began gathering support. And most importantly of all, she found Roger Mortimer, an English nobleman who had once been imprisoned by Edward but had since escaped to France. Together, Isabella and Mortimer recruited soldiers, courted disaffected nobles, and devised a plan for a bloodless invasion. In September of 1326, they landed on the shores of Orwell in Suffolk, bringing with them a small but well-trained force. And what followed was astonishing. Almost no one resisted. The people of England, exhausted by the cruelty of the Despensers and disillusioned by the king's failures, welcomed Isabella as a savior. From provincial towns to the capital in London, support for the Queen spread like wildfire across a dry field. Meanwhile, Edward II and Hugh Despencer panicked. The king and his favorite fled westward in desperation. But the tide had already turned. Hugh Despencer the Elder was captured at Bristol. Edward II himself was seized and imprisoned, no longer as a monarch, but as a traitor to his own kingdom. In January of 1327, for the first time in English history, a reigning monarch was formally deposed by Parliament, declared unworthy of the throne. Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, a 14-year-old prince who would ascend as Edward III. But what followed after Edward's removal from power would give rise to one of the most disturbing and enduring mysteries of England's medieval era. After being deposed, Edward II was not executed publicly like common traitors. Instead, he was placed under guarded house arrest at Berkeley Castle. Officially, His confinement was framed as a means of ensuring the former king's safety, but it was clear to all. His continued existence posed a political threat to the new regime led by Isabella and Roger Mortimer. And then, less than a year after his abdication, on September 21st, 1327, Edward II was declared dead. From the very beginning, rumors spread faster and more violently than any royal proclamation. Whispers claimed that Edward had not died of illness or grief, but had instead been murdered in the most horrific way imaginable, a method designed to leave no outward sign. According to the rumor, a red-hot poker had been thrust into his rectum, ensuring no external wounds and preventing any suspicion during examination. Berkeley Castle quickly became the epicenter of speculation. The castle's account books did record the former king's death, but the entry was brief and lacking in detail. His death was confirmed, but no witnesses were named. Even more suspicious was the fact that the lord of the castle, Thomas de Berkeley, was not present at the time of Edward's supposed demise. When the body was prepared for burial at Gloucester, it was embalmed and wrapped in cerés cloth, a thick waxed fabric used to fully encase the corpse. This meant that no one saw the king's bare body before it was sealed in the coffin. And so the question arose, was the body in that coffin truly Edward II? Years later, in 1330, Mortimer himself had Edmund, Earl of Kent, and Edward II's half-brother executed on charges of conspiring to rescue Edward from Corfe Castle, 3 years after the former king was said to have died. So if Edward had truly perished in 1327, why would Edmund risk his life to save a dead man? Even more puzzling, when Mortimer was overthrown in November of that same year, investigators discovered that one of the charges against him claimed he had intentionally spread rumors of Edward's survival in order to entrap and eliminate loyalists. But this only deepened the enigma. Was Mortimer lying to bait his enemies? Or had Edward II never died at all? So did Edward II truly perish at Berkeley, the victim of a grisly execution cloaked in secrecy? Or was he quietly rescued by loyal followers and allowed to live out the rest of his days in the shadows of obscurity? Nearly 700 years later, that question remains one of the most haunting mysteries of England's medieval monarchy. Do you believe Edward II truly died as the official records claim? Or do you lean toward the theory that he survived and vanished into obscurity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy mysterious stories from history like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming journeys. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we'll see you in the next video.